America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much. Has everyone had a chance to review the agenda for tonight's meeting?
Yes.
Someone want to move to approve it?
I'll make a motion to approve the agenda.
I'll second it.
Everyone in favor of adopting the agenda?
Aye.
Aye.
Everyone no? Agenda is approved. Has everyone had a chance to review the minutes of the meeting held October 17th, 2023?
Yes.
Yep.
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
Second.
Everyone in favor of approving the minutes of the meeting held October 17th, 2023? Say aye.
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 Everyone not? The minutes are approved. Do we have any items not on the agenda for tonight? Okay. So we can do the presentation and discussion of the staff proposed zoning text amendments.
Okay. So we have 4 of these to review with you tonight. I'm going to start with the 2 more complicated ones first, get them out of the way. So this first one is in regards to our townhouse parking requirements. Right now, our townhouse parking requirements are that townhouses require 2 parking spaces per unit, and the driveway may not count towards one of those spaces. So this amendment that we're proposing would tweak that. The first thing we would like to do is remove the requirement against you being able to use your driveway as one of your parking spots. We have heard from a number of developers over the last year, probably, that this causes problems when trying to design these subdivisions, just given their denser nature. And the fact of the matter is, people are going to park in their driveway. So might as well let that go ahead and count as a spot. However, when staff was looking at this particular requirement, we felt like the only reason it might be in place was because we were trying to get some extra parking, some guest parking, so that people who were visiting had some place to park their cars. So therefore, while we would like to let the driveway count as one of the spaces, we would also like to require a certain amount of guest parking per unit. So what we're proposing is keep the 2 spaces per townhouse unit, but then on top of that, require either 0.25 spaces or 0.5 spaces per unit for guests. And we're hoping you all might have some feedback or some comments for us tonight on what you think about those 2 numbers. This table right here shows 2 of our recent townhouse developments that were approved. And then 1 small townhouse subdivision that doesn't really exist. I just use that to provide a comparison of different size developments. So we take, for example, the Rosser Avenue subdivision that was approved last month that has 80 units and required 160 spaces. So with the 0.25 space requirement per unit, 20 additional spaces would be required. And then 40 additional spaces would be required with that 0.5 spaces per unit. And then you have the Hopeman Guilford subdivision, which is almost double the size. They had to have 326 spaces total per unit, or total in the overall neighborhood. And with the 0.25 spaces per unit requirement, 41 additional spaces would be required, or the 0.582. And then finally, the smaller development with just using the 6 as a number, they would be required to have 12 spaces. And then with the 0.25, an additional 1.5 space, which when we would be reviewing this, we would round that requirement up to 2. more than likely. So 2 additional spaces on top of the 12. Or if the 0.5 requirement is in place, it'd be 3 spaces.
So right now, like the Rosser Avenue subdivision, the 160 that were required, they were only getting 80 of those as like if it was their garage. So they were getting 80 through that. That was giving them one of their spaces. And then the other 80 they had to achieve not through their driveway spot because of our current ordinance, but through on-street parking. And so that varies with what the road width requirements are, and typically, based on the type of road widths they're looking for, we only want to see parking on one side of the road to, help with emergency vehicles and school buses and things like that. So that's how it's being done currently. And my thought process behind it is probably the reason it's worded the way it was is I think there's some conflicting points in our ordinance where maybe at one time it was desired for alleys to be rear-loaded. And now there's some difficulty with that. Public Works doesn't love alleys for the maintenance aspects and, all of the services that have to be provided off those alleys. So it's not something we're doing and permitting a lot these days is new developments with alleys. And so this seems like maybe that is why it was in there, but it did provide kind of a roundabout way of getting the guest parking. But it's a bit confusing to developers of, well, why can't we count that space if we're going to have it anyway? And so this guest parking percentage would give us a little bit additional, not as much as we're currently getting, but the 0.25 or 0.5 also mirror certain other localities that we've looked up that vary between either 0.25 or 0.5.
Would one of the collateral impacts of this be that you reduce the amount of paved surface in some of these subdivisions? And you'll have less on-street parking, less wide parking, less big parking lots at the end of the developments.
And like the Rosser one that was just approved, if you'll remember last month, they kind of had like parking areas in between the townhouse blocks. And that was kind of their way of almost like a little parking lot rather than the on-street, which, we kind of thought was nice. But then, a lot of the others are utilizing, that one side on-street. And then how dense the developments are, the mailboxes are so close together, it's really hard, on those entrances to really get one car on the street in between the two mailbox and driveway entrances in some of the developments.
Using the Rosser Avenue as an example, how will the guest parking be created there? What's your thoughts on that?
So what they showed on their development was they had, because they were under the ordinance that exists now, they could only count their garage as one of their spaces.
Right.
And then the other 80 were being provided through like little parking lot
Just like
areas
special
in
lot.
between
Yeah.
townhouse blocks. And that, it's to guest parking. It's also, if you have another car and you have so much stuff in your garage you can't fit, there are options there. I think they might have still, did they propose any parking on street?
No, I think it's all off.
Okay, it was all the parking areas.
Yeah,
Okay.
because of the narrow streets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is, it's different than the way the ordinance currently is. We would be getting less parking than what we're getting now with some of these developments, but it's more clear of what the intention is behind it. Like, it's for the guest parking, because if they're using it anyway, if they're they're having that second spot, well, why are we not letting that count? If townhouses only need 2 per, then someone's in the garage and someone's out. And you always, some people fill up their garage and they have to, use that, and maybe they take up some of the guests. But this just seems like a more realistic way of describing like what we're looking for in the parking. So, the more conservative thing to do based on what the ordinance currently is would be to go with the 0.5. But you'd also have the ability to do any of those. Those are just 2 examples we pulled from other localities. And like I said, tonight, there's no public hearing scheduled and no decisions need to be made. Staff just wanted to kind of go ahead and tell you these are things we're looking at changing, and that we would be scheduling public hearings probably in January or the beginning of next year. So get any feedback you may have on it, so that we know if, we're in the right direction to schedule those. So if you have any thoughts about 0.25 or 0.5, you could let us know now. You could think about it. We could always, do the advertisement to say both, like either or. It might be 0.25 or 0.5 to give you the flexibility at the public hearing to make that change. I'm sure we could do that also. But so any questions you have on these?
Now, would either one of the guest parking space requirements reduce the number of units from what they could put in today? Because they have to have a place to put the guest parking, which I'm guessing is going to take away from, if I didn't have a guest parking, I could get 4 more units in here.
Well, so we're not saying with the guest, like they could do the guest parking on street.
Oh,
If they wanted to make the, if they
Road
wanted to make the
wide.
road wide enough, they could, so it would be in how they do the layout. But it would definitely give them, they would have less parking than our ordinance requires today. So, theoretically, it would give them the ability to get more lots in there than they currently can, based on those numbers.
Is it also true that these space requirements are relative based off of the number of units of the subdivisions?
So for townhouses that we're talking about now, all townhouses require 2 spaces per townhouse. So in that regard, it doesn't vary based on the number of units. Obviously, it does in that it's, 2 per, so it changes with the number of units. But all townhouses require 2 per unit,
Okay.
no matter like the square footage size or anything like
It's
that.
just the number of guests that would be changing. Guests.
And essentially, right now, for the Rosser subdivision, there are 80 units, and they're required to have 160. So right now, they're getting 80 of those in their garages, but the other 80, they're having to find on the street. And so if we changed it to 0.5, rather than having to find another 80, they would be having to do only 40, so half of that. And they could be creative of whether they wanted to put them on the street or put them in kind of, so it's just, it's, we're calling it guest parking essentially because it's, the way the ordinance currently is written has been a roundabout way of getting us some guest parking.
yeah.
And now it's like, let's just be clear if guest parking is what we're interested in, or some additional percentage that gives a little bit of flexibility based on the denseness of the developments. And so my recommendation would probably be to do 0.5, just because, if you're thinking 80 additional are required now, and that's cutting that in half to 40, maybe that's significant enough to try at this point. So that would probably be my recommendation, but.
So are we talking about, I'm confused. Are we talking about, we're gonna, even though we're not gonna let them count the driveway, we're sort of just acknowledging that reality and as a result, reducing the requirement for guest parking?
So, okay, it is very confusing. So, right now, every townhouse has to have 2 parking spaces per unit. But the ordinance says your driveway spot does not count as a spot.
But does your garage count as?
Your
a spot?
garage counts as a
Okay.
spot. So you're getting, for Rosser, you're getting 80 of the 160 required. You're getting 80 of those in your garage. And the other 80, most likely, they're parking on their driveway, but that's not counting. So they have to find 80 somewhere else that's not on their driveway. And so they're finding that on the street, or like in that example, kind of in these enclave areas. And so this would be cutting that 80 by half. They'd still have their driveway spot like they always have. So it is essentially probably getting the city less guest parking than is required today, or less just overall parking. But it's being more clear about kind of what the intention is, since we're not requiring them to be rear-loaded. Why would we not say,
Right.
if we intend for every townhouse to have 2 spots, your driveway and your garage are those 2.
So why wouldn't we just get rid of this thing that says, the part of the ordinance that says you can't count your driveway?
So if we got rid of the part of the ordinance that says you can't count your driveway, then we wouldn't be getting, like, yeah, we are proposing to remove that.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
the
But then
driveway
if,
counts.
yeah, the driveway would count. And then if the driveway counts, then essentially we would be losing that additional parking that we're getting right now. So then we're also saying
Okay.
you have to have a guest percentage. So
So-
it's 2 parts.
So what we're really talking about is on an 80-unit subdivision as proposed, you'd have to come up with 2.5 or 2 1/4.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Count the garage,
The driveway,
and then
yeah.
another quarter.
Yes,
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
I
Yes.
now understand.
yes. We've talked about it so many times in so many
But
roundabout
this isn't
ways.
gonna, I mean, the density requirements by acre, my-
That would be the same.
right, I guess I would just be curious, if we've had developments where they couldn't get to where they wanted to be in terms of density requirements. Like if they were, like, oh, we could have gotten 4 more units in this development, but we didn't because we had to put parking lots in here. Because our density requirements are such that I don't really see that we're, it seems like they're getting right up to the density requirement in the most part anyways.
It's difficult to, I don't see the bottom line when it comes to development, but we're hearing from a lot of developers that it certainly affects the number of lots that they get.
Because I am reluctant to facilitate even more, these townhouse, you look at the one on Rosser and how densely it's packed in there. And that was by right, and, it is what it is. But if it's not really impacting density anyways, I think there's good reasons to do it, to just make it make more sense. But I don't want to facilitate even more density, if that makes sense.
Well, and I think in that way, it would depend on the layout. So, and there might be a little bit more density, but I think it also, helps in fitting in those public infrastructure requirements we have to have your sidewalk and your street trees and so it just and then if they could bump the road, a foot larger on each side and then not have the on-street parking for emergency services. So I'm sure it is a trade-off and yes, likely they may be able to get, I don't know, a handful of more lots, but I think there's a lot of other things that they're trying to fit into that public right-of-way. And when they're putting the parking in there, it's making it even more squeezed of a development. And when you look down like Ivy Commons and you're seeing all the people parking on one side of the street, it makes it look more dense.
Right.
Than if, and if it's allowed, they're going to do it anyway, but, so it's a combination of things. Our thought process was, it just makes it more clear what we're meaning, because it's very confusing to say you can't count your driveway, and they're like, well, why not? So this is a way of saying you can count your driveway, but 2 isn't enough for a townhouse, because you will have people come and visit, or you might overfill your garage and not be able to park in there, or you might park on the street because you don't want to block your spouse who's in the garage. There's all these options, so this is just saying,
4 people living in one.
yeah, so 2 is a little tight, 2 per is our thought process. So that's kind of what we're thinking about, making the change. But yeah, like I said, you all can think about it. We would schedule the public hearing probably early next year. But if you have any, major heartburn or recommendations on, the 0.25 or the 0.5 or some different number, you could do a 0.75, that's just us kind of throwing out some numbers, so. That's that one.
I personally, I hate to do anything that will allow more density. I think the density is, for Rosser Avenue, for example, I think Phil Lehman brought up a good point. You've got the Pratt's Run stormwater runoff issue. and there's 80 units going in there. He said, why couldn't that be reduced to 40? Well, it's a by right, so that can't happen. And it has to do with the comprehensive plan, so we're locked into that. But, I mean, I just, for that example, I'd hate to do anything that would allow them to get like 90 units in there.
The one thing I will say is that the more hard surface you have, the more stormwater control you have to have.
Yeah.
So, and the more stormwater facilities you have to have, and the more runoff you create. So, I agree, but there's also some merit, I think, in getting rid of big, flat, concrete paved parking. Like, I like that part of this sort of prospect.
Yeah.
And I think it makes sense to count
Your
the
driveway.
driveway, like, that's
Oh,
just
yeah.
common sense.
Since it's already a flat surface.
Right, and that's gonna be there anyways.
Well, and then, if that makes sense, then, there's always the ability to tinker with that number. So if it's 0.75 or, that you feel like is getting you to what we're talking about, something that makes sense, but also maybe not allowing for significant, and we could probably draw up, I'm trying to remember if we got a layout from anyone prior to, like hoping just to kind of compare, like what is the difference in number
Sort
of
of
units?
mock.
So we're being
Yeah.
clear of like what we're talking about. I'd be happy to see if that's something we could lay out so that, we're all understanding what that difference could be.
The best way to reduce density would be to require them to be make it be 4 or 5 and make them be on site. And then have to make the site's wide enough
Yeah,
and big enough to put two garage spots and 2 driveway spots.
And then no one ever builds anything in Waynesboro because they can't afford to.
Well, I'm just saying, if you want, that's the way
Yeah.
that would be the most aggressive way to reduce density.
Yeah.
If that's, that was sort of what we wanted to accomplish with this.
Is there a way to come up with a sweet spot to where you can make a space requirement that does reduce that flat surface space, that wouldn't allow for kind of like a medium between the sweet spot of the flat surface and the number of parking spots on the street to combat the stormwater issue with the flat surface, and then as well as the amount of density of units if we allow for them to expand due to the lack of parking space?
Yeah, I think it'd be helpful. I think we were just thinking that maybe one of the developments did submit us a layout on Guilford when they thought that they were able to count that spot, and then we had to say, no, you can't. And so this is the layout. So we could definitely, I'll go back and look at that and see what that unit difference
Yeah, that
was.
would be worthwhile.
And then that would just help everybody kind of be on the same page of, what that potentially could look like. Because I don't remember it being a significant difference, but I would want to check just to see, was it 5 units, 10 units, or was it much less? I can't quite remember. So we'll look at that, and we can make sure we follow up with that information. All right, any other questions on that one?
Do we have any idea, I don't know, if there's a way, and I'm just thinking anecdotally, is there a industry, is like 0.5 the industry standard? Is there something out there about how the, guest parking utilization study? I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think objectively about how to come up with something that's.
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember, do you know what 2, 5, and 5 came from?
Not specifically.
So we looked up other localities, and I think most do a 2 per townhouse. I mean, everybody's a little different, but especially cities, I would say most it's probably 2 per, and then several had either a 0.25 or a 0.5, so I haven't seen any studies, but we were in line with other cities and the parking requirement.
Is that counting or not counting the driveway for other municipalities?
That's a good question. Some, if they require being rear loaded.
I think only one locality restricted driveway use other than us. I think most others you could use.
They can count the driveway, okay.
What does rear loaded mean? I'm new at this, so
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
a new term.
Yeah, so like if a townhouse, a townhouse sat up like near the street and you had a sidewalk that you kind of entered your townhouse from, potentially, and then an alley in the back where you drove around and your driveway was in the back of your house and your garage. And so in planning terms, they refer to it as being rear loaded.
If
So you
the
would have no,
house is
you would have
back-
no, you know, your little yard and sidewalk would be the only thing up against the public right of way.
Good
Okay.
example of that is at Seventh Street in Delphine, where those two new, they aren't townhouses, but they are duplexes, and they're rear loaded because you come in through, from the alley and park in the back.
And it's really common from like a planning and development standpoint, but it does, you know, it is difficult for emergency services vehicles and, you know, all kinds of public works, trash pickup and snow removal. And so there's always that, like, how, you know, what balance do we strike to, you know, see
Nobody
what
wants
types
to
of
maintain the
development.
alleys. I have one. Nobody wants to maintain them. It's a constant battle.
But we also can pull some of the other localities when we let you know about the Guilford kind of differences in numbers, just so you can get a feel for, you know, how we're in line with kind of other cities in the area.
Is your sense that the difference in density is just marginal?
From what I remember from that Guilford development it was, but I'd have to look to make sure. And I mean, at that point, it's a little bit conceptual with their stormwater. You know, everybody
Right.
can be creative about the layout,
Right.
but.
I'd be curious to know how, what Will suggested would affect Guilford if you made 2 in the garage and 2 in the driveway, how that affected the overall density of a development.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, if they do have a 2-car garage, then that does count as their 2. So if they were to build a 2-car garage,
And then the
then they
parking-
would be, then the park, and if the way the current ordinance is written, the driveway spot doesn't count, you know, they'd still be finding some on the street. So, I mean, it seems like there's some change that needs to be made, and, you know, this is one proposal.
Yeah, I'm all for getting cars off the street, because over there where I live off of D Street, they park on both sides of the roads over there. And if a bus is coming, you gotta stop, and only one of y'all can fit.
Are the Ivy Commons, are they 2-car garages or one? Are they all? I'm trying to remember.
Ivy Commons is 2-car. Evershire is 1 car, but Ivy Commons is,
They look like one.
yeah. 2-car garage.
So I mean, you could still have, even with a 2-car garage, you could still have, and that's pretty dense, in my opinion. Like, those townhouses are pretty dense up there. So you could still, it wouldn't necessarily. Yeah.
Yeah, Ivy Commons is the single family.
I'm thinking of the townhouses on the back. They're townhouses, aren't they townhouses?
Does that ever,
Off
that's,
of
Evershire.
yes. Those are single-car garages.
they are
Those are all
single
single
car.
car.
Ivy
Yeah.
Commons is the single family
Okay.
2-car. That's, yeah, right near that. Ready to move to the next one?
I think so.
Okay.
Okay, so this next one has to do with our parking lot landscaping requirements. Staff realized a while ago that there's a contradictory section in this specific section of the ordinance that deals with our buffers, or vegetative buffers requirements for developments. So for the parking lot landscaping requirements, it's a 2-section having to do with the perimeter of the parking area. And the second requirement, the perimeter of all parking areas and other vehicular use areas adjacent to residentially zoned property shall provide a Class C buffer. And then it continues, a compact hedge or low wall may be substituted for other buffer requirements in the CB district or CO district. And what staff is recommending here is removing that section regarding the Class C buffer around the perimeter of the parking areas. Reason for this is that there is a table in the same section of the ordinance that provides the type of buffers that should be required between a property that's being developed and an adjacent zoning district. And there are 3 buffer types, Class A, B, and C. And these would be buffers that would be required around the perimeters of these properties where applicable. And this is just a quick description of each of the buffers. The Class A is a 10-foot buffer with 2 canopy trees, 2 understory trees, and 12 shrubs. The Class B is the 15-foot with the evergreen tree, a canopy tree, and 2 understory trees and 16 shrubs. And then the Class C buffer is the 20-foot buffer. And in addition to the plantings, it also requires a wall fence or berm. So staff is interested in removing this requirement because it often conflicts with the buffer that's already required around the perimeter of the property. And it causes problems there. And in some cases, there's space limitations where you could fit a 15-foot buffer, you can't legitimately fit a 20-foot buffer. But you, so it keeps it, this change would keep the buffer requirements consistent in all areas of the development.
And likely that the section that talks about parking areas, it's kind of vague of what that means, like a parking lot, certainly. But if you, or can you go to the next so you can see that the B, the A is the less robust and the B is second, and the B already covers all those uses that are then adjacent to different residential or business uses. So I think the thought process was, a more robust buffer should be against a parking lot because maybe you have, parking lighting and, things like that. And so the point's well taken, but you're getting essentially close to the same thing between the B and C, other than the fact that it's the difference of 5 feet. And then you also have to have, in addition to the plantings, a berm or a wall. And you don't have the flexibility. The ordinance doesn't give you the flexibility to say, okay, well, we want that number of plantings, but we want you to kind of cram it into 15 feet rather than 20. And so we've just run into a lot of issues where it's like, that's what the ordinance says, so you got to have a Class C buffer there. And in a lot of cases, I'm not sure it's providing, the necessary benefit when you already have a prescribed buffer adjacent to the parking area.
Seems to make sense to me to remove the contradictory language.
Well, and if you're putting those plantings in and a wall or a berm, it's a little bit excessive in my opinion. I mean, if you're putting light or heavy industrial, which is down at the bottom, next to all of those different residential types or some business types, then you have to do the C. And so that makes sense because yes, maybe it is more impactful where you'd want the fence and the plantings. But a parking lot, a parking area adjacent to some of those, in my opinion, the B,
Right.
at least giving the flexibility of, okay, you have a certain number of plantings and you have a 15-foot buffer, seems sufficient. And doesn't create an issue where, you have to have the fence and you have to have the 20 feet when it, sometimes space is limited. And, it could be done a different way if that you weren't comfortable with just outright removing that. We could add some additional language potentially about just creating like the flexibility for staff to kind of review a plan, and so that's another way we could handle it. Because you do have flexibility in one of the, B is what gives the flexibility. So essentially, we would be going back to that.
So B would just be like a default.
Well, B would be all those places, I mean, the majority of them are B, and it's more impactful uses against residential. And so, yes, it would allow the flexibility in what that buffer looked like, and it would require the 15-foot. The C just has gotten us in places where it's a bit excessive, and, okay, you have to put the trees, but then you also have to put the wall or the berm or the fence adjacent to a parking area.
So if we just said, remove or left the proposed remove the provision you're in there, but then said, at the discretion of staff, a compact hedge or low wall may be substituted, would that leave the requirement in places where we might have this issue, but give you the discretion to fix it when? So if you go back to the text of the.
So like a case by case basis?
Yeah, so if you left your line through section N, and then you just put in, at the beginning of that sentence, you put in the discretion of staff, a compact hedge or low wall may be substituted. That way you leave the requirement there in the case where you do have maybe not, something that's not a use that requires that buffer yet, but still creates a screen around a parking area where one is needed.
Yeah, I do think we could play with that a little bit to, because we do have the flexibility for the compact hedge or low wall to be substituted for other buffer requirements in the CB district or CO district.
Yeah, so I apologize. You'd have to maybe you just have to get rid of it for CB or CO alone, and you say, whenever you guys say it's okay to do that instead, you can do that.
Yeah, I mean, we would prefer the most increased flexibility, because even if it's not a parking area, it could be another area where they're at 17 feet and not 20, but they're putting in all the same plantings, and they're even doing the wall, but you're in a frustrating spot because you're not at the width. So removing that, and then, I mean, I think it'd be helpful to remove the CB and CO and just kind of have that flexibility would be helpful. So we'd be happy to do that.
That seems to make sense.
Okay. All right, any other questions on those? I think the next two are super easy.
Yeah, so this next one is straightforward. As some of you all probably remember, passed the temporary special events ordinance earlier this year. I found out a couple months ago that there's actually a typo in that in regards to the temporary structures and how long they're allowed to remain in place before being considered permanent. Per the Virginia statewide building code, temporary structures are actually those that are erected for 179 days or less. 180 days or more, they're considered permanent structures. So this amendment would just fix that number, 179 instead of 180, so that's accurate as to what's considered a temporary structure.
Fairly straightforward.
And then our last one has to do with the section of our ordinance that sets out the requirements for accessory buildings. Currently, this section of the ordinance just refers to buildings. However, it's been historically interpreted as applying to both buildings and structures. So this amendment would help clarify this section of the ordinance so that it's clear to everyone trying to reference it that it does apply to both accessory buildings and structures. And structures are those things that are things you might build, like pools or that sense, things that aren't under roof.
Yeah, I think the definition of building says something about having walls and a roof. And so there are other things, other structures that you might not want in your front yard. And so this is just clarifying the way it's been interpreted. That all those requirements would be for accessory buildings and structures. Fences are already covered separately. Under the structures too.
Fences would fall under structures? So you couldn't build a fence within 5 feet of your house?
There's no setback for fences.
But if we put, but if fences are structures and no structure can be located closer than 5 feet from the building, then I can't put my fence right to the edge of my building, right?
No, the building, yes, the building has to be 5 feet away, the fence does not.
But if we put structure in there and fences are structures, won't it?
I thought there was a different section that talked about the setback and the fence.
Fences have specific requirements. Fences have specific requirements.
Yeah, I thought a fence had to set 1 foot on the inside of the property line, and the good side had to face the neighbor.
I think you could fence on your property line.
Oh, you
I think so.
I asked because I did. And it's connected to my house.
Yeah, I think there is.
Mine's not connected to my house, but it's way bigger than 60% of the floor area of the principal building.
I got my yard fenced in too, but.
It's probably 3 times the area of the principal building.
I was thinking that there was a separate fence section.
There is, but it just talks about the height in the front yard and rear yard.
So it would probably be helpful on this one for us to, well, we'll go back and look at that fence section. And then I think it would be helpful for us to set up a definition for structure.
Yeah.
And we could list some of those things like a pool, and other, there's some other things like, you might not want someone to have a big gazebo in the front, or, there are some things based on certain areas where that may be considered
We do have a definition for structure, and fences are
in that.
considered structures, yeah.
So I think that we need to look at that,
Yeah.
because it does talk about all the things like advertising signs, swimming pools, but fences are in there.
Yeah.
So I think we need to look at that in this and figure out, make sure it's not conflicting anywhere else in the ordinance, and that we're getting what we intend. But that's what we intend, is to eliminate things like pools and that, and so this is helpful, so we'll make sure we look at that and make some amendments prior to scheduling any kind of public hearings. And this one we could bring back to you before we schedule anything, just to make sure everyone is in agreement on those.
Because don't pools have their own specific requirements, for fencing and access and
They do.
all
Yeah.
that?
Yeah.
Yeah, the only thing is the height requirement on the fences.
Yeah, so we definitely want to make sure
Yeah.
that, the height requirements are all, stay the same, but that, yes, you could put a fence in the front. So we'll amend that. And we can bring it back for you all to look at.
Okay, do we have any other correspondence or communication?
I do have a couple subdivisions for you tonight.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry, I skipped that one.
Okay, so our first subdivision is located just off of Delphine on B Street. And it was actually correcting a subdivision that was done illegally. So this is reconfiguring these 3 lots is what it was. And so what they did was adjust the lot lines So there was a larger Lot A, and then Lot 9 and 10 were revised, and this was for, to allow a duplex to be built. So this is a lot line adjustment plat, essentially. The next one was off of Ludewitt Boulevard, right across from the Lowe's. And kind of hard to see, but mainly this again was a lot line adjustment plat, where they were basically moving some lot lines around to provide for public right-of-way and access to that triangular parcel for a new car wash. So this was just a plat sorting through that between them and the adjoining property to the north.
Car washes must be doing one devil of a business. I think we got 50.
Did you see what the sign in front of the one that they're building on Rosser says for the hiring range for the manager?
No, I ain't been on
80,000,
it.
right?
80 to 200,000 compensation.
Oh, Lord.
I might get out of the legal business.
And those are all I have for you tonight.
That's all we have.
Okay. Somebody want to move to adjourn?
I'll make a motion that we adjourn. Oh, wait a minute, we got comment.
Oh, sorry. Please approach the podium, stranger.
Hashim Halstead at 1625 Edge Hill in Waynesboro. So, Will, I know you were asking earlier about those parking studies. I read those. And for the most part, they don't really exist, and a lot of it's just, historically for almost all cities in America, it's just doing what the surrounding municipalities tend to do. And I think that's an interesting way to do things, but it is a way to do things, and it has worked for a long time. I think anything that helps us to lessen parking mandates is a great move, because that would allow for more density. Like most American downtowns, like in small towns like Waynesboro, are rendered almost useless or unusable because of parking mandates. If we're honest, like that's one of the main things that keeps us from using our downtown, because we can't really put in more housing if one building has 8 units and it requires 16 parking spaces, but there's not 16 parking spaces behind the French press that are able to be used for that. So they'd have to buy 2 buildings, tear one down, just so they can put parking spaces, which is not really feasible in a small town when it comes like just dollar cost average wise. Like a developer wouldn't be like, man, I'd spend $2 million for one, $4 million for the second one, just turn it into parking. The parking's not making me any money. So then now you're in a housing crisis, which I wouldn't say that we're in a crisis yet. So obviously everybody in this room lives in Waynesboro. We're not living on the streets currently. But I think that there are people who do, but I know for a fact, I know tens of people that would love to move to Waynesboro, but it's having a hard time just finding a place to stay. So I think even moving the parking minimum to allowing the driveway to count is be a huge win. So I'm not saying we should do what Richmond and Roanoke, 2 thriving cities in Virginia, have done, which is eliminate parking mandates. But I guess history will tell us whether they're right or wrong.
Thank you very much.
I've got a quick question for Allison and Leslie. After the last meeting, I noticed that off of where Kirby Avenue runs between Kirby Avenue and the new Sunset Park, there was the space between the subdivision and the Sunset Park is now for sale. Although there's no signs up, it was being advertised as I forget how many, 100 and some units that had been pre-approved.
Don't know if you know.
Because I'm just wondering if those units were pre-approved when Shields initially put that subdivision in 30 years ago.
They're just platted lots.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, there are existing platted lots there, but yeah, the 50. That's what I thought it was. Like 50 lots, but then also certain requirements we have currently wouldn't allow you to build on all of those lots without improved streets and,
Yeah, 'cause the access to those lots is in between two houses. They took a lot, didn't build a house, and left it as access.
yeah, so that was back when you could kind of plat out lots before you had to provide those public improvements. So those are,
Yep.
not the way we do things anymore.
And of course, that's a one-way in, one-way out development too. And Ivanhoe and Reservoir and Frisk Street all meet right there. And plus, they were talking about that big development back there off of May Avenue in front of the, I can never remember the dentist's name.
Bowman.
Yeah, Dr. Bowman place. They've sold that. And, I did see a sign up there for that to be developed. I forget how many units.
And yeah, I mean, with the platted lots, they kind of advertise it as that way, but then they have to, meet so many other
Okay.
requirements,
Yeah, 'cause
which may or may not get that density.
I wasn't looking forward to seeing 180-some units up behind my house.
And likely anything like that would require rezoning to get to that density.
Yep. All right. I'll make a motion that we adjourn this evening's meeting of the Planning Commission.
Second?
Second.
Everyone in favor?
Aye.
Everyone who wants to stay and meet some more? We are done.